Welcome to the layer by layer overview of Psalm 98. A way to remember this psalm is with the phrase, a new song for the Lord the King. In Hebrew, a new song is a victory song. The Lord, the King, has a victory to celebrate in this psalm. We'll start by looking at the structure of the psalm. The psalm has 3 sections. The first is Victory for Israel, which opens with a call to sing. Sing, because he has made known his victory. In the second, the singing expands into full-blown music for the King, where all the earth is called to shout aloud in celebration of the King. The last section explains what makes this King special. He will be a judge for all the earth. This gives a motive for nature to roar in joy before the King who will rule with equity. The Lord's role runs throughout the entire psalm. The praise is addressed to the Lord, as can be seen in the bolded green words in the first 2 sections. The praise is also prompted by the Lord, or, in Hebrew terms, done before the Lord, as seen in the bolded blue words. All the praise is to him as audience and before him as the reason for praising. The emotional tone of the psalm is important for understanding it correctly. The section on victory is dominated by awe and joy as it introduces the victory. The section on music overflows with delight and gratitude. The section on the Lord coming to rule the earth adds to the joy, eagerness to see this coming King. We'll now walk through the poem, explaining it verse by verse. Superscription, a psalm. More than half of the psalms have superscriptions. This superscription only lets us know that, perhaps in an earlier collection, Psalm 98 was specifically identified as a psalm. It is probably more interesting for people studying the history of the Psalms than it is helpful in understanding the meaning of the psalm itself. Victory for Israel. In the first section, the Lord already has won a victory. His people respond. Verse 1. Sing to the Lord a new song, for he has done wonderful deeds. His right hand and his holy arm have won for himself a victory. A new song is specifically a victory song, which means this psalm is a response to a victory. While there is no immediate indication of a specific historical incident, the language suggests that this is referring, in part at least, to the return from exile. After Israel and Judah had broken the covenant and sinned for hundreds of years, the nations were exiled, defeated by their enemies, and taken from their land to live far away in Assyria and Babylon. After 70 years, many of the people were able to return to the land of Israel. This may be the immediate context of the psalm. However, much of the psalm looks forward more so than backward. The phrase wonderful deeds is used specifically for royal deeds that make a king noteworthy. From the first verse, the poem is declaring that this is the victory of a king. This is not a king who depends on others to fight for him, but a king who wins his own victories by his own power. His right hand and his holy arm indicate that there are no allies or helpers. The Lord alone is responsible for victory. The language of wonderful deeds and arm is associated especially with the Exodus story. This Exodus imagery is reused in Isaiah, which we will see may be important. The phrase holy arm is only found elsewhere in the Old Testament in Isaiah. To say that he has won for himself a victory suggests that he not only won the victory by himself, but also for himself, in the sense that he proved himself victorious. The Lord has made known that he and no one else is the victor. Verse 2. The Lord has made known his victory. He has revealed his righteousness in the sight of the nations. The focus here is not the victory itself, but instead communicating this victory to the nations. Local battles happened all the time, without the surrounding nations taking any interest. This victory is different. It is not only of interest, but it is actively made widely known, even reaching the surrounding nations. His righteousness indicates what kind of victory this is. This is a victory that corrects injustice and creates justice, setting wrongs right. Given that it is in the sight of the nations, it must be a victory that has international significance. Verse 3. He has remembered his loyalty and his faithfulness for the sake of the household of Israel. All the ends of the earth have seen the victory of our God. The content of the Lord's victory is remembering his loyalty and faithfulness to Israel. This is where there is a strong connection with Isaiah. In Isaiah 52, there's very similar content within a clear setting, when the captive nation is released from her bondage in exile. When she is released, the good news would be announced. Isaiah 52, verses 7 to 10. How beautiful upon the mountains are the feet of him who brings good news, who publishes peace, who brings good news of happiness, who publishes salvation, who says to Zion, your God reigns. The voice of your watchmen, they lift up their voice. Together they sing for joy. For eye to eye they see the return of the Lord to Zion. Break forth together into singing, you waste places of Jerusalem. For the Lord has comforted his people. He has redeemed Jerusalem. The Lord has bared his holy arm before the eyes of all the nations. And all the ends of the earth shall see the salvation of our God. This makes it very likely that this psalm is referring to the return from exile too, when, even after letting his people go into exile, the Lord remembered them faithfully and returned them to their land. The return from exile would signify their deliverance or victory over their captors, ending their captivity and restoring them to their own land. The nations saw the exile as shameful. The return from exile is here depicted as a glorious victory, visible to all the ends of the earth, referring to all known humanity at the time. Music for the King. Ancient Near Eastern views of God had a clear framework for understanding great victories. An important victory would be celebrated by parading the spoils of war to the temple of the God who gave the king the power to win the victory. Some psalms, such as Psalm 68, follow this storyline. Another framework is understanding victories that inaugurate or begin a kingdom. This might be a brand new kingdom or the extending of an existing kingdom into new territory. The return from exile meant the Lord had returned to Jerusalem and once again ruled as king over Jerusalem. The idea of a kingdom spreading to include new territory was depicted with images of enthronement, portraying a king sitting on a throne in order to establish himself securely as king over a specific territory. In ancient Israel, enthronement was accompanied by a grand musical celebration, which is exactly what happens in this next part of Psalm 98. The music is prepared to welcome the king to his throne. Verse 4. all the earth, shout to the Lord, burst into song, cry aloud, and sing. The wording in verses 4 to 6 does not merely describe a musical celebration. It actually embodies one. The celebration starts with a shout, like the shout of triumph that brought down the walls of Jericho in Joshua 6. They burst into song, wording that conveys the happy and joyous action of the redeemed, such as many places in Isaiah. Sing is a different word here from the opening of the psalm and includes instrumental music, as becomes clear in verses 5 and 6. Verse 5, sing to the Lord with the lute and the sound of music. The instruments mentioned are those included in victory celebrations after battle, such as in 2 Chronicles 20, verses 27 and 28. In that passage, we see the full sequence of battle, miraculous deliverance, and musical celebration. These instruments also are used to celebrate the enthronement of a king, such as in 1 Kings 1, 39-40, when Solomon was made king. Here, Psalm 98 has a poetic section mimicking one of these celebrations. The lute is a stringed instrument that is plucked. The double mention of with the lute is the center of a chiasm, meaning that the words create a nested structure of parallel sounds, with the last words repeating the sound of the first words. This creates a rippling echo of beautiful sounds, which participate in the very worship they describe. Verse 6, with trumpets and the sound of the horn trumpet, shout before the Lord, the King. The musical celebration finishes with more clever wordplay that uses similar sounds. With trumpets, sounds like burst into song. And the shout of verse 6 repeats exactly the shout of verse 4. The trumpets are another signal for a momentous occasion, and the precise patterning of musical language creates a poetic center for this psalm that literally bursts into song. While the section opened in verse 4 with shout to the Lord, it closes in verse 6 with shout before the Lord, the King. If the setting of this psalm is the return from exile, which is suggested by the similar wording in Isaiah, the musical celebration is not for a human king, but is still appropriate for the divine king, the Lord himself. Even without a king on David's throne, the Lord remains king and remains worthy of such celebration. A ruler for all the earth. In verse 3, the victory was on display before the nations, and all the earth was encouraged to sing in verse 4. Even those limits are expanded in verse 7, when nature itself is called upon to join in the celebration of the Lord, the King. Verse 7, let the sea and its fullness roar, and let the land and those who dwell in it roar. The sea is often an image of the forces of chaos, which attempt to threaten the Lord. Here, the sea and everything in it roars, but nature obeys the new king. Instead of raging against the Lord, the sea now roars in joyful response to his coming. The former enemy has become a worshiper. Verse 8, let the rivers clap their hands. Let the mountains cry aloud together. People clapped their hands and cried aloud to celebrate the enthronement of Joash in 2 Kings 11. But what does it mean for rivers and mountains to clap their hands and cry aloud? The image of rivers clapping their hands has long delighted and puzzled its readers. This is the Hebrew image of a river expressing the greatest of joys as it celebrates the coming of its king. This may be rushing water, as may be suggested by Ezekiel 1 and 43, in which the angel's wings and God's voice are described like the roar of rushing waters. Similarly, the mountains crying aloud may sound similar to the wings of the creatures in Ezekiel, which sound like the tumult of an army. These are all images attempting to convey the awe and majesty surrounding the Lord. Verse 9, before the Lord. For he is coming to rule the earth. He will rule the land with righteousness, and he will rule the peoples with equity. Verse 9 begins in a very unexpected way with before the Lord, which we might have expected at the end of verse 8. By beginning verse 9 like this, however, the poem says something powerful. It is not just the mountains crying aloud together before the Lord, but the entire section, possibly even the entire poem up to this point, takes place before the Lord, meaning in his honor and in anticipation of him. The musical celebration was for the Lord, the King. Nature bursts out before the Lord, the King. The new song was sung to the Lord in verse 1. The earth shouted to the Lord in verse 6, and it all equally happened before the Lord. Why? Because he is coming to rule the earth. The righteousness that was announced in verse 2 is going to be applied to all nations. He will rule as king over all peoples with righteousness and equity. The role of a king was to fight battles to protect the people, enact righteous laws, and execute justice by judging according to those laws. History, of course, was full of unjust laws and a failure to bring about justice. In the context of a return from exile, righteousness and equity among the peoples was a matter of national sin, judgment, and restoration. Israel was exiled as judgment for her sin, but she was also restored out of loyalty to the covenant, as sung in verse 2. The same was expected of other nations, that the Lord would equally judge them for their sin. But some, whom he chose, would also have hope of restoration as part of his people. Israel had learned that the Lord's loyalty did not mean protection from any harm. It meant faithfulness to rule, to judge and purify, along with faithfulness to restore. The Lord's character implied the same could be true for other nations. This hope of impending righteous judgment was cause for the greatest celebration from Israel, the nations, and indeed nature itself. The final word, equity, sounds like the opening word, sing, in verse 1. Equity for the earth was an excellent reason to sing. Psalm 98 is a psalm that celebrates two victories, or deliverances, at once. Based on the parallels with Isaiah 52, it seems to celebrate the return from exile, where Israel was delivered from captivity and returned to her land with great rejoicing. That victory was seen, as is common in Israelite theology, as a symbolic representation of a future victory that would inaugurate a kingdom ruled with righteousness and equity. In that future kingdom, the Lord would reign as king over all the earth, not just over Israel. The psalm anticipates this universal extent of his kingship with a musical celebration appropriate for a great victory and possibly an enthronement of a king over new territory. The shouting, singing, and instruments all convey the appropriate fanfare for the new king, the Lord, taking his rightful place after his victory. The familiar musical celebration is joined by a much less familiar celebration. Nature itself joins in recognizing the Lord, with roaring and clapping hands and crying aloud in ways that can only be imagined. This imagery conveys that creation itself recognizes the Lord as king. When foreign gods reigned, the seas and rivers would symbolize chaos, and the mountains would symbolize the homes of the foreign gods. When the Lord reigned, they would serve him and express themselves to join in his celebration. The celebration may have been prompted by the return from exile, but its real purpose was to look forward to a future event, when the Lord himself would come, bringing righteousness not only for Israel, but for all the earth. Injustice and violence were unfortunately very common, as Israel had experienced abundantly during the exile. But the Lord would come and bring equity for the peoples. The natural response was to sing for joy. We will now read the psalm in its entirety. Sing to the Lord a new song, for he has done wonderful deeds. His right hand and his holy arm have won for himself a victory. The Lord has made known his victory. He has revealed his righteousness in the sight of the nations. He has remembered his loyalty and his faithfulness for the sake of the household of Israel. All the ends of the earth have seen the victory of our God. All the earth, shout to the Lord, burst into song, cry aloud and sing. Sing to the Lord with the lute and the sound of music, with trumpets and the sound of the horn trumpet. Shout before the Lord, the King. Let the sea and its fullness roar, and let the land and those who dwell in it roar. Let the rivers clap their hands. Let the mountains cry aloud together before the Lord, for he is coming to rule the earth. He will rule the land with righteousness, and he will rule the peoples with equity. This has been the overview video for Psalm 93. Our goal in this video is to present a single coherent interpretation of the psalm. Our exegetical issues video discusses other scholarly views, and our poetic features video explores the distinctively poetic nature of the psalm as Hebrew poetry. Please visit us at scriptura.world to learn more about our project and the details of this psalm in particular. Thank you.